Welcome to Grey Vale Echoes. Dive into chilling gothic horror, where haunted castles, ghostly secrets, and eerie relics unravel terrifying truths. Join us for spine-tingling tales of the unknown. Tonight, we explore a fear as old as humanity itself, being buried alive. But for one man, the horror isn't just being trapped. The horror is realizing that in the suffocating darkness, he is not alone. Our story tonight begins with an awakening. But this is not the gentle, gradual awakening from a peaceful night's sleep. This is not the slow return to consciousness in a warm, familiar bed, with the first soft light of morning filtering through a window. No, this is an awakening of a far more brutal and horrifying kind. It is a sudden, violent wrenching from the oblivion of unconsciousness into a reality so terrible, so profoundly wrong, that the human mind is simply not equipped to process it. This is the story of a man named Jack, and his story begins, as so many of the most terrifying tales do, in darkness. His first sensation was not sight or sound, but a feeling of profound and absolute constraint. He was lying on his back on a hard, unyielding surface. But it was not just the surface beneath him that was hard. There was a surface above him, too, and on either side of him, he was encased. His first groggy thought was that he was in a small room, perhaps a closet or a storage space. He had a vague, hazy memory of a tavern, of loud laughter, of the bitter taste of cheap wine. Had he drunk too much? Had his friends, as a cruel joke, carried him here and left him to sleep it off? The thought, irritating as it was almost comforting in its mundane cruelty. He tried to sit up, and it was in that simple, instinctive movement that the first true spike of ice-cold dread pierced the fog of his confusion. His forehead hit something hard, solid, wood. He hit it with a sickening, hollow thump that echoed in the tiny, enclosed space. The impact was jarring, painful, but the physical shock was nothing compared to the psychological one. He wasn't in a small room. The ceiling wasn't a few feet above him. It was inches from his face. Panic, a wild, primal, animal panic, began to claw its way up his throat. He reached out his hands, his fingers splayed, desperately trying to understand the geography of his prison. His fingertips immediately met with the same rough, unplanned wood above him. He pushed upwards, his muscles straining. The surface didn't budge. It was immovable. Solid, sealed. He flailed his arms out to the sides. More wood. He tried to bend his knees. They, too, were met with an unyielding wooden barrier. He was in a box. The concept was so simple yet so utterly monstrous. He was in a box. A long, narrow, man-sized box. His mind, still fighting against the terrible, dawning realization, offered up another, less terrifying possibility. A shipping crate? A storage container? He was being transported somewhere. Yes, that had to be it. It was a kidnapping, a robbery. It was a human crime, a situation that, while dangerous, still operated within the known rules of the world. But then, a new detail asserted itself, a detail from his sense of touch that dismantled his desperate, flimsy theories. He was not lying on bare wood. The surface beneath him was padded, and it was soft, almost silky, to the touch. He was also wearing clothes he did not recognize. Not his usual rough, everyday attire. He was dressed in a suit. A fine, well-made suit, the kind of formal where a man might be dressed in for a special occasion. And the air was wrong. It was still and close and carried a faint, cloying chemical scent. The scent of varnish and cheap perfume. The pieces of the puzzle, each one more horrifying than the last, began to slam into place in his mind. The confining space, the darkness, the wood, the padded interior, the formal suit. It was a sequence of facts that led to only one possible, one unthinkable conclusion. This was not a closet. This was not a shipping crate. He was in a coffin. The realization was not a thought. It was a physical event. It was a detonation behind his eyes. A wave of pure, white-hot terror so absolute that it momentarily short-circuited his ability to think, to breathe, to scream. His heart, which had been pounding, seemed to stop altogether for a moment before restarting with a frantic, hammering beat that was so loud in his ears it felt like it would shatter his own skull. He had been buried, mistaken for dead. This was not a cruel joke or a criminal act. This was a mistake. Terrible, fatal, bureaucratic error. And he had woken up just in time to appreciate the full, exquisite horror of it. He was at his own funeral, and he was the only one who had shown up alive. This was the true beginning of the horror. The descent into a madness born of utter helplessness and the absolute certainty of a slow, agonizing death. The prison of wood that surrounded him was no longer just a box. It was his tomb. He ran his fingers frantically over its surfaces, desperately searching for a loose board, a weak joint, any sign of imperfection that might offer a sliver of hope. But there was none. It was cheaply made, but it was sturdy. The lid was nailed shut. He could feel the faint, rough protrusions of the nail heads against his fingertips. He was sealed in, a specimen in a jar, a letter in an envelope that had been mailed to eternity. The darkness was a living thing. It was a complete and total blackness, a darkness so profound it felt like a physical substance. It pressed against his open eyes, a thick, velvety weight. There was no light, not a single photon, not the faintest hint of a difference between having his eyes open or squeezed shut. It was the blackness of the void, the darkness that existed before creation. And in this darkness, his other senses became painfully, terrifyingly acute. He could feel the rough texture of the wood grain under his nails. He could feel the constricting pressure of his own suit, a garment that was now his shroud. He could feel the frantic pulse beating in his own throat. And he could feel the air, or rather, the lack of it. It was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of wood varnish and his own panicked sweat. Every breath he took was a conscious, deliberate act, and with each inhalation, he was aware that he was using up a finite, irreplaceable resource. The air was a countdown timer. Each breath was 1 second closer to the inevitable, suffocating end. This knowledge was a new and special kind of torture. He was not just trapped. He was on a clock. He tried to control his breathing, to take slow, shallow sips of the precious, dwindling oxygen. But the panic was a wild animal in his chest, making him gasp and pant, burning through his remaining time with a terrible, self-destructive speed. And just as he thought the horror had reached its absolute, unscalable peak, he heard it. The sound of the end. It was a sound from outside his wooden prison. A muffled, rhythmic, and utterly sickening sound. Thud, scrape, it was the sound of a shovel digging into a pile of earth. And then, a new sound, a soft, heavy pat-pat-pat against the lid of his coffin, just inches from his face. It was the sound of dirt, the sound of loose earth being shoveled onto his tomb. A scream, a raw, ragged, inhuman sound of pure terror, was ripped from his throat.
No.
Stop.
I'm Eliv.
I'm in here. He screamed until his throat was raw, until his voice was a shredded, useless thing. But the sound was swallowed by the wood, by the deadening layers of his own prison. To the world outside, he was silent. He began to beat against the lid of the coffin with his fists, a frantic, desperate drumming. He hammered and hammered until his knuckles were bruised and bleeding, the sharp, stinging pain a welcome distraction from the psychological agony. Let me out. For the love of God. I'm alive. But the only response was the steady, remorseless continuation of the sound from above. Thud, scrape, pat, pat, pat. With each shovelful of earth that landed on the lid, the darkness in the coffin deepened, if such a thing were even possible. The sound from the outside world grew more and more muffled. The weight on the lid increased. He could feel it, a subtle but definite pressure building above him. Each shovelful was another layer of permanence, another nail in his fate. They were burying him. They were sealing him away from the sun, from the air, from life itself. He was being methodically, efficiently erased from the world. The horror of his situation was compounded by the mundane, workaday rhythm of the gravediggers above. To them, this was just a job, the end of a shift, the final task of the day. To him, it was the end of everything. The thudding continued for what felt like an eternity. Each soft impact on the wood was a physical blow to his sanity. He was a creature in a burrow, and his enemies were sealing up the entrance. He screamed and beat against the wood until he had no strength left, until his arms were leaden weights and his voice was a raw, bloody whisper. He collapsed back against the padded lining of the coffin, exhausted, defeated, a trembling, sweat-soaked wreck. He could do nothing but lie there and listen to the final, terrible sounds of his own burial. And then it stopped. The thudding of the dirt, the scraping of the shovel, it all ceased, and it was replaced by a silence so profound, so absolute, that it was more terrifying than any noise he had ever heard. It was the silence of the grave, the deep, heavy, eternal silence of a haunted setting 6 feet under the ground. He was now completely and utterly cut off from the world of the living. The air above, the sun, the sounds of life, they might as well have been on another planet. He was alone, utterly, completely and finally alone, trapped in a prison of wood, in a tomb of earth, in an ocean of perfect, suffocating silence and darkness. The first stage of his ordeal was over. He had been buried alive. The physical horror was complete. Now, lying there in the absolute silent blackness, the psychological horror, the slow, creeping madness of the grave, was about to begin. And he had no idea, no possible way of knowing, that the true terror of his situation was not the fact that he was alone. The true terror was that he was wrong. The silence that followed the departure of the gravediggers was a physical entity. It was a thick, heavy blanket that smothered all sensation. In the absolute, unyielding darkness of his wooden prison, Jack's mind, deprived of all external stimuli, began to turn inward and to prey upon itself. The initial, frantic, animal panic had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, gray ashes of utter despair. He lay perfectly still, his body a leaden weight, his limbs aching from his futile struggle. The reality of his situation had settled in not as a sharp, piercing thought, but as a dull, crushing certainty. This was it. This was the end. His life was now to be measured not in years or days, but in the slow, agonizing depletion of the stale, thin air trapped in the coffin with him. For a long time, which could have been minutes or hours, he simply lay there, adrift in a sea of silent, black hopelessness. His mind replayed the events that had led him here, the fragmented memories of the tavern, the laughter of his friends. Was it an accident? A rare medical condition that mimicked death so perfectly that even a doctor had been fooled? Or was it something more sinister? Had someone poisoned him? Had an enemy, or perhaps a friend with a hidden grudge, arranged this perfect, untraceable murder? The questions were a form of self-torture, pointless and unanswerable, but they were the only thing his mind could do to distract itself from the single, overwhelming reality of his entombment. But even in the deepest despair, the instinct for survival is a stubborn, tenacious thing. After the initial wave of hopelessness had washed over him, a tiny, fragile spark of desperate hope began to glow in the darkness of his mind. It was a foolish, irrational hope, but it was hope nonetheless. What if it was a mistake? A terrible mistake that could still be rectified? What if someone realized? What if a friend, a relative, felt a sudden, inexplicable pang of doubt? What if they insisted on a second examination? What if the cemetery had a night watchman, a groundskeeper making his rounds, who might, by some 1 in a billion chance, hear a sound from beneath the earth? The spark ignited. It was a desperate hope, a madman's logic, but it was better than the suffocating certainty of death. He had to try. He had to make a sound. He had to do something, anything, to fight against the silent, patient embrace of the grave. He gathered what little strength he had left. He took a deep, shuddering breath, tasting the foul, chemical-laced air, and he began to shout again. His voice was a raw, croaking thing now, but he poured every ounce of his remaining life force into it. "Help! Alive! Down here! Help me!" He screamed the words over and over, a desperate, rhythmic litany of hope. He paused between each shout, listening with an intensity that was physically painful, straining his ears for any sound from the world above. A distant footstep, a shout in return, anything. But his only response was the dead, sound-absorbing silence of the earth. His voice was a tiny, insignificant vibration, swallowed whole by the 6 feet of soil that separated him from the world of the living. It was like shouting into a vacuum. The silence that answered him was profound and absolute, a final, unarguable statement of his complete and utter isolation. He didn't give up. He began to beat against the lid of the coffin again, not with the frantic, panicked hammering of before, but with a steady, deliberate rhythm. Bang, bang, bang. He was trying to create a signal, a code, a sound that was recognizably artificial, a sound that could not be mistaken for the natural settling of the earth. He hammered until his bruised knuckles screamed in protest, until his arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. He would bang for a minute, then stop, listening, straining, praying. And again, nothing. Only the immense, crushing silence. The silence laughed at him. It mocked his pathetic efforts. It was a wall that he could not breach. The last vestiges of his hope began to crumble. He was going to die here, slowly, agonizingly, in the dark. The realization settled over him once more, this time with a cold, final finality. There would be no rescue. There would be no last-minute miracle. This coffin was his world now, and it would be his tomb. He let his arms fall limp at his sides. He stopped shouting. He surrendered. He lay back and waited for the end, his mind beginning to slip into a strange, detached state of resignation. And it was in that moment of absolute surrender, in that perfect self-imposed silence, that he heard it. A sound. It was not a sound from above. It was not the sound of a rescuer's shovel. It was not a sound from the world of the living. It was a sound from the earth. It was a faint, yet distinct, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. His entire body went rigid. His senses, which had been shutting down in despair, snapped into a state of hyper-alertness. Was he imagining it? Was it the sound of his own frantic heart, a phantom echo in his ears? He held his breath, forcing his own body into absolute stillness, listening with an intensity that was almost a form of prayer. There it was again. Tap, tap, tap. It was real. It was undeniably real. And it was not coming from above him. He tilted his head, trying to triangulate the source, a ridiculous act in his confined space, but his instincts took over. The sound was coming from the side, from somewhere nearby, through the thick, muffling layer of dirt. It was a sound that was traveling horizontally through the earth to reach him. The initial shock gave way to a wave of utter, mind-bending disbelief. He was not alone. The thought was so staggering, so completely outside the realm of possibility, that his mind struggled to form it. The sound, the rhythmic tapping, could only mean one thing. There was someone else down here, and they were trying to communicate. The eerie mystery of his situation had just deepened exponentially. He was not just a victim of a terrible mistake. He was now a participant in a chilling encounter. The tapping continued, slow and methodical. It was not the frantic, desperate hammering of someone who had just woken up in a coffin. It was a calm, patient, almost leisurely sound, as if it had been going on for a very, very long time. A new wave of terror, of a completely different and more profound kind, washed over him. The first horror had been a physical one, the horror of claustrophobia, of suffocation. This was a new horror, a supernatural horror. The tapping was too close. The earth should have muffled it completely. But it was clear, a sharp, distinct knocking sound. And that could only mean one thing. The source was close, frighteningly close. He realized with a new jolt of terror that the sound was coming from another coffin. An impossible neighbor, buried in the grave next to his own. Who was it? Was it another poor soul like himself? A victim of a premature burial who had woken to the same nightmare? The thought was both horrifying and, in a strange, twisted way, comforting. To have a companion in misery, a fellow sufferer to share this final, terrible ordeal with. It was a ghastly sort of camaraderie, but it was better than being utterly alone. Perhaps they could coordinate their efforts, bang in unison, increase their chances of being heard, however slim. He tried to signal back. He lifted his aching arm and knocked on the side of his coffin, trying to mimic the rhythm he was hearing. Tap, tap, tap. He waited, his entire being focused on the response. For a moment, the tapping from the other coffin stopped. Profound silence fell once more, and then it answered him. Tap, tap, tap. It had heard him. It was responding. A bizarre, surreal communication had been established. Two souls, buried alive, speaking to each other in the most primitive language possible. A language of knocks and silence, through a wall of earth and wood. A shared fate. For a while, this strange, silent conversation continued. He would tap, and his unseen neighbor would tap back. The rhythm never changed. The slow, deliberate, patient pace remained constant. But the more he listened, the more a new, creeping dread began to poison the strange comfort he had felt. There was something wrong with the tapping. It was too patient, too calm. A person who had just woken up in a coffin would be in a state of frantic, screaming panic, just as he had been. They would be hammering, clawing, fighting for their life. They would not be tapping with the slow, unhurried, almost meditative rhythm. This was not the sound of someone who had just arrived. This was the sound of someone who had been here for a while. A long, long while. Long enough to have passed through the stages of panic and despair and into a state of calm, patient acceptance. Or perhaps into a state of something else entirely. The eerie mystery was shifting again. Was his neighbor truly another living person? The thought, once it had taken root, began to grow into a monstrous tree of terror in his mind. Cemeteries are full of coffins, and most of them are not occupied by the living. The slow, deliberate tapping began to sound less like a signal from a fellow victim and more like something else. Sounded like a welcome, like the patient, persistent knocking of a resident welcoming a newcomer to the neighborhood. He stopped tapping back. He lay there in the dark, listening to the steady, rhythmic sound from the other coffin, and his blood ran cold. The sound was no longer a source of comfort. It was a source of profound, supernatural horror. He was not alone in the dark. But his companion was not another living soul. His companion was one of the dead. The tapping was not a cry for help. It was a summons, and it was coming for him. The realization that his unseen neighbor was not a fellow victim, but something else entirely, was a turning point in Jack's ordeal. The horror transformed. It was no longer a race against the slow depletion of oxygen. It had become a desperate, psychological battle against a creeping, supernatural dread. He lay rigid in the darkness, every muscle tensed, listening to the slow, methodical tap, tap, tap that echoed through the earth. The sound had become a form of torture, a constant, rhythmic reminder that he was not alone, and that his companion was something ancient, patient, and utterly inhuman. He tried to block it out. He pressed his hands over his ears, a futile gesture that did nothing to stop the sound he felt vibrating through the very wood of his coffin. He tried to focus on his own breathing, on the frantic, panicked beating of his own heart, anything to drown out the maddeningly steady rhythm from next door. But it was impossible. The tapping was the only landmark in his sensory-deprived world, the only external event, and his mind clung to it even as it recoiled in terror. He had gone from being terrified of the silence to being terrified of the sound. The silence was the loneliness of the grave, but the sound was the company of it, and he did not know which was worse. After what felt like an eternity of this rhythmic torment, a new element began to intrude upon his prison. A new sensation that was even more terrifying because it was not a sound, but a feeling. It was a change in temperature. A sudden, intense, and unnatural chill began to seep into the coffin. First, he dismissed it. He was buried underground, after all. The earth was naturally cool. But this was not the gentle, damp coolness of the soil. This was a piercing, aggressive cold, a cold that felt sharp and predatory. It did not gradually lower the temperature of the air around him. It seemed to manifest in specific spots, like pockets of absolute zero. He felt it first on his cheek, a sensation like a shard of ice being pressed against his skin, even though nothing was touching him. Then he felt it on his hands, a deep, aching cold that seemed to penetrate straight to the bone, making his fingers feel numb and brittle. This was a supernatural chill. It was a coldness that had no physical source. It felt ancient, the deep, eternal cold of a place where the sun had never shone, the cold of a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. And he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, where it was coming from. The cold was radiating from the direction of the tapping. It was as if his unseen neighbor were breathing out a frost of pure, malevolent energy, a chill that was passing through the earth, through the wood of his own coffin, and into his very body. The presence was no longer just auditory. It was now thermal. It was affecting his physical environment. It was invading his space. With the unnatural cold came a change in the air he was breathing. The atmosphere in the coffin, already stale and thin, became fouled with a new scent. He had grown accustomed to the smell of varnish and his own fear, but this was a new and infinitely more disturbing aroma. It was the smell of decay. It was not the fresh, organic smell of damp earth. It was a dry, sweet, and sickly smell, the smell of ancient things returning to dust. It was the scent of linen bandages that had crumbled away after centuries, of desiccated flesh and brittle bone, of flowers that had been dead for 1,000 years. It was the smell of a long-sealed Egyptian tomb, of a forgotten crypt, of earth that had been saturated with the slow, patient process of decomposition for so long that the very soil itself had become a part of the dead. The scent was cloying, nauseating. It filled his lungs with every ragged breath, a physical ingestion of the graveyard's essence. The smell, like the cold, seemed to be seeping in from the side, a gaseous manifestation of the thing that was tapping, tapping, tapping in the darkness next to him. His prison of wood was no longer a simple, sterile box. It was being transformed into an extension of the ancient grave beside it. The cold, the smell, the tapping, they were all components of a single, encroaching presence. The barrier between his coffin and the one next to it was dissolving. The very atmosphere was being colonized by this ancient, unseen entity. Deprived of sight, his mind, now poisoned by fear, cold, and the foul stench of decay, began to create its own horrors. The absolute blackness behind his eyelids was no longer a simple void. It became a canvas. And on this canvas, his terror began to paint ghostly visions. They were not clear, defined images. They were fleeting, subliminal flashes, like faulty frames in a reel of film. For a split second, he would see an image burned into the darkness. A face. A skeletal face, its jaw slack, its flesh long since turned to dust, leaving only the gleam of yellowed bone. And the eyes were the worst part. They were just two black, empty sockets, voids of absolute nothingness that seemed to stare directly into his soul. The vision would be there for a heartbeat, a perfect, detailed nightmare, and then it would be gone, leaving him once again in the suffocating black. But the afterimage remained, seared into his mind. Then another flash would come. This time it would be a hand, a skeletal hand with long, spider-like fingers, the bones unnaturally clean and white against the blackness. He would see it reaching, grasping, its fingers crooked into a claw. The visions were involuntary, uncontrollable. He would squeeze his eyes shut, trying to banish them, but it made no difference. The images were not being seen with his eyes. They were being projected directly into his brain. Were they just hallucinations? The product of a mind breaking under the strain of unimaginable terror and oxygen deprivation? Or were they something more? Were they a form of communication? Was the entity in the next grave showing him what it was? Was it giving him a preview of what he would become? The ambiguity was a form of torture in itself. He was trapped in a state of not knowing whether his own mind was his enemy, or if the enemy was something far more real and far more ancient. Just as he felt he might be on the verge of succumbing to a screaming, babbling madness, a new sensation began, one that was far more concrete than the ghostly visions. A vibration. He felt it through the wooden plank he was lying on. It was not the sharp, percussive vibration of the tapping. This was a low, steady, and deeply unsettling tremor. It was a faint, scraping, grinding feeling. He strained to understand it. Was it an earthquake? The settling of the earth? No, it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It felt like something was moving through the soil just outside his coffin. It felt like something was digging. The feeling was faint, but undeniable. A slow, methodical scraping, like the sound of dry, bony fingers clawing their way through the compacted dirt, or the sound of a coffin itself being dragged, inch by painful inch, through the earth. The vibration was a tactile manifestation of movement. The entity was no longer stationary. It was no longer content to simply tap from its own prison. It was on the move, and it was coming towards him. The terror this new sensation induced was of a different order entirely. The tapping had been unnerving. The cold and the smell had been invasive. The visions had been terrifying. But this was the sound of a direct and purposeful approach. The barrier of earth that had separated him from the source of the horror was being breached. The distance was closing. He could feel the vibrations growing stronger, the scraping sound becoming more defined. It was the sound of something dragging itself, a slow, laborious journey through the grave. He pictured the skeletal thing from his visions, pulling its own rotting coffin through the soil, its bony fingers digging into the dirt for leverage. He imagined it inching closer and closer to his own small, wooden sanctuary, drawn by the warmth of his living body, by the frantic, panicked energy of his fear. He was a beacon of life in a world of death, and one of its residents had noticed him. The scraping continued, a slow, remorseless sound that seemed to go on for an eternity. He lay there, paralyzed by a fear so profound it had gone beyond screaming. He was a mouse in a wall, listening to the sound of a cat scratching at the plaster, knowing that at any moment, a claw would break through. He was a swimmer in the deep ocean, watching a dark shape rise towards him from the abyss. The chilling encounter was entering its final, terrible phase. The unseen was about to become the unspeakably close. The psychological horror was about to become a physical one. And all he could do was lie there, in the cold, stinking, absolute dark, and wait. Time, in the suffocating blackness of the coffin, had lost all meaning. There was only the eternal now, a continuous, unbroken experience of pure terror. Jack lay in a state beyond fear, a place of cold, paralytic dread where his mind could only register the escalating sequence of horrors without being able to truly react. He was a passive observer of his own damnation. The slow, grinding, scraping sound of the approaching entity was the soundtrack to his final hours. A remorseless funeral dirge played on instruments of bone and earth. He had become intimately familiar with the sound, its texture, its rhythm. He could trace its progress as it moved through the soil, a slow, shambling horror dragging itself ever closer. Then the sound changed, and this change signaled the beginning of the final, terrible act. The slow, rhythmic tapping, which had been his first contact with the unseen neighbor, had long since stopped. It had been replaced by the more menacing sound of the scraping and dragging. Now even that sound ceased. A profound and sudden silence fell, a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise it replaced. It was a silence of arrival. The journey was over. The entity had reached its destination, and its destination was him. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there was nothing, only the absolute blackness, the foul, cloying smell of the grave, and the piercing, supernatural cold. Jack lay there, his body rigid, his ears straining, every nerve ending screaming in anticipation. It was the moment before the lightning strike, the moment before the predator's final lunge. He knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the wood surrounding him, that the thing was now just outside his coffin. It was there, inches away, separated from him only by a thin, fragile plank of pine. And then, a new sound began. It was not the tapping from before. It was not the scraping through the dirt. It was a new sound, a sound so faint, so dry, so close, that it made the hair on his arms stand up and his skin crawl with 1,000 tiny, repulsive pinpricks. It was a scratching sound, a faint, dry scratch, scratch, scratch like the sound of a dead leaf skittering across stone, or the sound of a rat's claws on wood, or the sound of a single, long, brittle fingernail being dragged, slowly and deliberately, across the outside of his coffin. The sound was not random. It was methodical. It started at the foot of his coffin, a faint, almost inaudible sound. He could barely hear it, but he could feel it. A tiny, high-frequency vibration that traveled through the wood and into the bones of his feet. He could feel the fine, gritty texture of the sound, the slight resistance of the wood against whatever was making it. The scratching began to move, slowly, agonizingly. It crept up the side of the coffin, a dry, whispering sound of inexorable progress. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It moved past his legs, past his waist. He could follow its journey with a terrifying precision, the tiny vibrations traveling up his body, mapping the path of the unseen horror just on the other side of the wall. He was a man lying in a bed, listening to a spider crawl across his pillow in the dark. The sheer proximity of the thing was a new and exquisite form of torture. It was a chilling encounter of the most intimate kind. The presence was here. It was touching his world. It was exploring the outer surfaces of his prison with a patient, tactile curiosity. He tried to press himself against the opposite side of the coffin, a useless, instinctive attempt to put as much distance as possible between himself and the sound. But there was nowhere to go. The coffin was barely wider than his own shoulders. He was pinned, a butterfly on a board, while something sharp and terrible traced the outline of his body from the outside. The scratching continued its slow, upward journey. It was a sound of immense age, a dry, dusty sound that spoke of things that had long since lost all moisture, all life. He pictured the skeletal hand from his visions, one long, bony finger extended, its tip sharpened to a point, drawing a line on his coffin, marking him as its own. The scratching sound reached the level of his head, paused there right next to his ear. The silence that followed was, if possible, even more terrifying than the sound itself. He was acutely, painfully aware of the presence. It was right there, a silent, unseen, unknowable entity, hovering just on the other side of the wood, its attention, its focus, its entire being, concentrated on him. He could almost feel its gaze, a cold, heavy pressure against the side of his skull. And then, the spot on the wood directly beside his head, the spot where the scratching had stopped, became intensely, unnaturally cold. The supernatural chill, which had been a diffuse presence in the coffin, now focused itself into a single, concentrated point of absolute zero. It was a cold so profound it felt like a burn. He flinched away, turning his head, but he could still feel the frigid energy radiating from that spot, a circle of grave cold that seemed to be leaching the warmth directly from his body and soul. The supernatural horror was no longer just a sound or a smell. It was a focused, tangible force. The entity was projecting its very essence, its deathly nature, through the wood. He lay there, paralyzed, his mind screaming, waiting for the final, inevitable violation. He didn't know what to expect. Would the wood splinter? Would a bony hand burst through into his tiny, dark space? Would he hear a voice whisper in his ear from the other side? The not knowing was a madness in itself. The cold spot intensified, the pressure of the unseen gaze grew heavier. He could feel the last of his sanity beginning to fray, the thin threads of his reason snapping one by one under the unbearable strain. And then it happened. The climax, the final, unthinkable horror. The cold spot on the wood did not change, but the wood itself seemed to groan slightly, to give way, and he felt a distinct, undeniable, and utterly terrifying pressure against the outside of his coffin. It was not a sharp point. It was not a random impact. The shape of the pressure was specific. It was recognizable. It was the shape of a hand. He felt it as clearly as if it were pressing against his own skin. He could feel the distinct, separate pressures of 5 long, thin fingers. He could feel the broader, solid pressure of a palm. It was a cold, bony hand, and it was pressing, slowly but firmly, against the outside of his coffin, right next to his head. The wood seemed to groan and flex inward under the steady, remorseless pressure. It was a touch from the grave, a physical, tactile connection with the undead thing that had been tormenting him. The barrier was gone. The supernatural had made contact. A scream, a sound of such pure, primal, mind-shattering terror that it bore no resemblance to a human voice, was ripped from the depths of his soul. It was the sound of a mind breaking, of a spirit being annihilated. He screamed and screamed into the unhearing darkness, his voice a raw, animal shriek of ultimate horror. He thrashed in the coffin, his limbs flailing wildly, his body convulsing in a desperate, futile attempt to get away from the terrible, cold pressure of that hand. He beat against the lid, against the sides, his movements no longer an attempt to escape, but the mindless, spastic jerking of a creature in its death throes. The hand did not move. It did not retreat. It just pressed. A steady, patient, and impossibly strong pressure. It was not trying to break through the wood. The pressure was not violent. It was almost curious. Possessive, exploratory touch. It was as if the entity were feeling the warmth of the life that was just on the other side of the wood, savoring the terror it was causing. It was a touch that said, I am here. I can reach you. You belong to me now. The combination of the absolute darkness, the suffocating air, the maddening sounds, and now, this final, ultimate violation of a physical touch from an impossible source, was the final catalyst. Jack's mind, unable to process the sheer, layered horror of his situation, simply broke. His screaming dissolved into a series of choked, hysterical sobs, and then into a low, keening moan. His thrashing subsided into a weak, uncontrollable trembling. The world dissolved. The coffin, the darkness, the cold, the hand, it all melted away into a merciful, protective wave of blackness as his consciousness finally gave up the fight and fled into the welcoming oblivion of a dead faint. He had been buried alive, and he had been found by what lived in the ground. The chilling encounter was complete. He had touched the hand of the grave, and the grave had touched him back. Jack's descent into the welcoming blackness of a dead faint was an act of mercy. It was his mind's final, desperate defense mechanism, a circuit breaker flipping to prevent a complete and irreparable overload. He was spared from the continued, conscious horror of the cold hand, from the dwindling air, from the maddening, suffocating prison of his own tomb. For a time, which could have been minutes or hours, he was blessedly absent from his own terrifying reality. His story, it seemed, had reached its dark and silent conclusion. But his story was not over. In one of the great, inexplicable twists of fate that litter the strange annals of history, Jack's desperate hope, the one he had long since abandoned, came to pass. A rescue did come, not because of his own frantic cries, but because of a series of fortunate coincidences in the world above, the world of the living. A late-night messenger, carrying urgent news, had arrived at the home of one of Jack's dearest friends. The friend, upon hearing of Jack's sudden death and hasty burial, was seized by a profound and unshakable sense of doubt. He recalled Jack's occasional bouts of catalepsy, a rare condition that could perfectly mimic the appearance of death. Fueled by a desperate, almost mad intuition, he gathered a few other stout-hearted friends, and they rode through the night to the lonely country churchyard where Jack had been laid to rest. Their arrival, with lanterns held high against the dark, their shovels striking the damp earth, was a scene of frantic, almost ghoulish, desperation. The sounds that reached Jack, deep in his unconscious state, must have been the stuff of nightmares, the return of the digging, the scraping of shovels. But this time it was the sound of salvation. When they finally broke through the last layer of earth and their shovels struck the wood of the coffin, the sound must have been a thunderclap of hope. They pried open the lid, and the first thing that met Jack was not sight or sound, but the glorious, intoxicating rush of cool, fresh night air filling his oxygen-starved lungs. He was saved. He had been pulled back from the very brink, a man reborn from his own grave. But the man who was pulled from that coffin was not the same man who had been placed inside it. The physical ordeal was over, but the psychological and supernatural ordeal had left an indelible, ghostly scar upon his soul. As he was carried away, as his friends celebrated their miraculous, last-minute rescue, Jack's mind was not on his salvation. It was on the companion he had left behind in the dark. And this is where our story transforms from a tale of terrifying survival into a true and profound unsolved mystery. As Jack recovered his strength and his sanity, he recounted his experience. He spoke of the waking horror, the claustrophobia, the frantic beating against the lid. And then, his voice dropping to a hushed, trembling whisper, he spoke of the tapping. He described the slow, rhythmic sound from the neighboring grave, the impossible communication through the earth. He spoke of the unnatural cold, the foul scent of decay, the ghostly visions of a skeletal face. And finally, with a terror that was still fresh and raw, he spoke of the scratching, and of the final horrifying pressure of a cold, bony hand against the side of his coffin. His friends, of course, were skeptical. They attributed his story to the predictable horrors of oxygen deprivation, to hallucinations born of extreme terror. The mind, they reasoned, when faced with such an unimaginable situation, would surely create its own phantoms. It was a logical, comforting explanation. But Jack was adamant. It was real. The tapping was real. The cold was real. The hand, he insisted, was real. To placate him, and perhaps to satisfy a sliver of their own morbid curiosity, an investigation was made. The groundskeeper of the churchyard was questioned. The cemetery records were meticulously checked. And what they found, or rather what they did not find, only deepened the eerie mystery. According to the records and the groundskeeper's sworn testimony, the plot of land next to Jack's grave was empty. It was virgin ground. No one had been buried there for over 50 years. The last occupant of that neighboring plot had been laid to rest in the previous century. There were no other recent burials nearby. There was no other coffin from which the tapping could have come. This official, documented fact casts the entire story into the realm of the truly inexplicable. If there was no other coffin, what was the source of the sound? If there was no other body, what was the source of the supernatural cold, the scent of ancient decay? And most terrifyingly, if there was no other person, living or dead, buried beside him, then whose hand had he felt? This is the first and most central enigma of the unsolved grave. We are left to contemplate the nature of Jack's ghostly companion. Was it truly a fellow victim of a premature burial, as he had first hoped? The cemetery records would suggest not. But records can be lost. Groundskeepers can be mistaken. Is it possible that there was another unrecorded burial? A secret grave for a secret shame? Perhaps Jack's unseen neighbor was a victim not just of a medical mistake, but of a foul crime, their body disposed of in an unmarked, unconsecrated patch of earth. In this scenario, the tapping would have been a genuine cry for help, a desperate attempt to alert the living world to the presence of two trapped souls. The cold hand would have been a final, frantic attempt at communication, a touch of shared desperation. It is a tragic, gothic possibility. But the nature of the encounter, its patience, its otherworldly cold, its terrifying climax, suggests another, more supernatural explanation. What if the presence was not a contemporary? What if it was the original occupant of that 50-year-old grave? Or something older still? What if it was a spirit, an entity that had been waiting in the dark for a very, very long time, and the sudden arrival of a living, breathing, terrified mind next door was a novelty it could not resist? This paints the entity not as a fellow victim, but as a predator. A lonely, ancient thing, amusing itself with a new plaything. The tapping was not a cry for help. It was the prodding of a curious and malevolent intelligence. The cold hand was not a gesture of communication. It was an act of possession, a claim being staked. The identity of the hand, then, becomes the ultimate question. If we follow the supernatural path, the hand was a literal, physical manifestation of a ghostly entity. It was the hand of a long-dead corpse, reanimated by a malevolent will, reaching through the soil to touch the world of the living. It was the hand of a ghoul, a spirit of the graveyard, a creature whose entire existence is tied to the soil and the dead within it. This is supernatural horror in its purest form, a direct violation of the laws that separate the living from the dead. But there is another possibility, one that is, in its own way, just as terrifying. This is the final, lingering question of the unsolved mystery. Was the hand real, or was it a product of Jack's own breaking mind? Consider his state. He was in absolute darkness, deprived of all sensory input. He was in a state of extreme terror, his body flooded with adrenaline. He was slowly being starved of oxygen, a condition known to produce powerful and vivid hallucinations. Is it not possible that the entire supernatural encounter, the tapping, the cold, the visions, the hand, was an elaborate, intricate, and terrifyingly convincing hallucination? A story his mind constructed to make sense of the incomprehensible horror of his situation? In this interpretation, the tapping was the sound of his own blood pulsing in his ears, a rhythm his mind interpreted as an external signal. The cold was his body's own physical reaction to shock, the blood retreating from his extremities. The visions of the skeletal face were self-portraits of his own impending fate. And the hand was the final, tactile hallucination, a physical manifestation of his own fear of being touched by death. It was a ghostly vision, a waking nightmare from which he could not escape because he was already in the deepest nightmare imaginable. This psychological explanation is, in some ways, more disturbing than the supernatural one. The idea of a ghost in the next grave is a terrifying external threat. But the idea that your own mind can betray you so completely, that it can create a reality so detailed and so horrifying that you cannot distinguish it from the truth, is a horror of a different kind. It is the horror of ultimate unreliability. If you cannot trust your own senses, what can you trust? The hand, then, becomes a symbol of his sanity crumbling, of his mind touching a madness from which it might never fully recover. And so, we are left with this perfect, unsolved enigma. Jack was rescued, but the mystery was not. It remains buried in that lonely churchyard. Did he have a ghostly companion, a real, supernatural entity that reached out to him in the dark? Or was he truly alone? His only companion, the terrifying phantoms created by his own mind as it broke apart under the strain? We will never know. The truth of what happened in that coffin is as sealed and as inaccessible as the grave itself. And that is the final, chilling touch of this story. The most terrifying question is not, whose hand was it? It is the question Jack himself must have lived with for the rest of his days. A question that would haunt his quiet moments and his darkest dreams. Was the hand real, or was it me? Was the monster in the next grave, or was the monster inside my own mind? And when you are buried alive 6 feet under the ground, in the absolute silent dark, what really is the difference? The coffin is opened, but the mystery of what happened in the darkness remains buried. Jack is saved from the grave, but his mind is forever haunted by the memory of that cold, unseen hand and its chilling touch. Whose hand was it? And a more terrifying question. Was the hand real, or was it just the first sign of a mind breaking apart in the dark? Let me know your theory. Thanks for braving the shadows with Gravevale Echoes. What creepy secret haunts you? Subscribe, share your fears, and return for more gothic chills from the unseen world.